Hello, everyone. I am Lyndsey. I am a user experience researcher here at PNNL. And we'll see if PowerPoint is going to cooperate with me. So welcome. This is our brief crash course on how to conduct interviews with your potential users. So yes, as mentioned, I am Lyndsey, the researcher and frequent question asker, actually doing interviews and focus groups and some of that observational stuff that we'll talk about later is actually quite a lot of what I do on a day-to-day basis. With me, we have the most excellent Liz Stevens, director at MESA, and as well, oh dear, okay, phew. Sorry, I thought there was, all right, Saturday morning. We also have Dr. Margarita Magana with us as well. And Liz, Margarita, did you want to take a moment to say hello and introduce yourself beyond what I've thrown in?
I'll just give a quick hello and thank you everyone for being present and joining us today, and especially in support of our Washington MESA.
Yes, thank you so much for being here, especially on a Saturday. It's exciting to see you all.
All right. Actually, I'm going to go back because I have in my presenter notes, now that we've got a few more people in the room, that we wanted to take a moment briefly just before we got started to introduce the rest of the folks in the room. Maybe if you want to give kind of a quick shout out, your name, your location, your role in MESA.
And feel free to type it in the chat. I'll go ahead and put the 3 things there as well. Either way.
Oh, yeah, there's the chat. Okay.
Well, hi, Bill, and hi, Marie.
All right.
Well, here we go. Got New Mexico. We got more folks from Washington. Hi, Sezzy. Hi, Ashley. Hi, Lynn.
All right.
Oh, so we're from New Mexico. Shout out.
Okay. This is going to be Washington versus New Mexico for this hour.
Oh yeah, another New Mexico.
Okay, well, cool. We're I think many of us, at least on the PNNL side, are up here in slightly snowy Washington today. So hello to all of you folks in New Mexico. I hope the weather is better over there for you all. All right, so moving into things, tried to start off with, kind of a quick, if you remember nothing else, oh, sun, I could really use some sun right now. I'm supposed to go do a long run today, and I'm gonna have to go find a gym and do it on a treadmill because it's not safe. So a little bit of weather envy. All right, so moving into things, if you remember nothing else from today, these are, kind of 4 high-level points that anytime anybody, here at the lab, one of my coworkers, comes to talk to me about, hey, we think we need to do some user interviewing on a project for, whatever reason. These are kind of the 4 things that I try to make sure that I get communicated to them, regardless of any other style of how they choose to do interviews, however many interviews they do, whoever they talk to. This is kind of the bottom line up front. And so I'm going to start with that top one, which is surprisingly subtle, but it's really sometimes kind of difficult to get people to appreciate. And that is the only safe assumption going into any user interview, any kind of requirements gathering, or however you're approaching this, your only safe assumption is that everything else you've assumed could be completely wrong. There have been any number of projects where we've gone in thinking, you know, hey, we're going to build this particular thing on this project. We go in to talk to some of our initial would-be users, and we find out that, you know, not only is that the wrong thing to build, but it's something that would never actually even work to begin with for some very good reasons. There have been any number of times when we've had to like pivot on a project very early on because we took the time to ask, you know, hey, we've got this idea, what do you think? And they're like, oh, we tried that and it's not going to work for, you know, XYZ reasons. So when you go into interviews, prepared to find out that, you know, hey, we're going to need to pivot like right away. Something else that really helps with doing interviews, regardless of who you're talking to and at what stage of your process you're in, is understanding your own purpose for asking the questions that you're asking. I think a lot of times when people try to prepare for an interview, they think about, well, what's every possible question I could possibly want to ask this person, and so they go in with this great big long list of things that, you know, could be very interesting to talk about. But if you take a second to think about, well, why am I asking them, you know, what I don't know, do they prefer I don't know, green rugs or blue rugs? Trying to come up with a silly example here. You know, maybe I don't know, maybe you're going to ask them about interior decor. We're you know, coming up with a silly example here, but you know, if you can explain why you want to ask that question, you may find that, you know, well, maybe that's a question I could get answered some other way, and so I don't actually need to take the time to bother someone with it in an interview. Bother is probably the wrong word, but it's something that, you know, maybe you can save yourself some time if you can either find out about it in a different way, or if you think about it, it's not something that's actually going to change you know, the outcome of the thing that you're potentially going to build for someone. So yeah, if you're asking about the rug color, you know, that matters if you're doing interior design, but you know, if you're actually designing I don't know, vacuums or something, you know, the vacuum probably doesn't care if the rug is blue or green. So maybe that's something that you can skip over and not have to think about. I'll come up with much better examples later when the coffee kicks in. Other things to think about. There are many different ways of conducting interviews. It's good to be flexible and to really think about what you want to get out of it. We'll discuss 3 different options here in a little bit, but don't think that an interview is you sitting down one-on-one with another person, reading from a list of questions and listening to what they have to say. It's better to think about, and this kind of ties in nicely with number 4, is that, you know, interviews can make people nervous if they feel very formalized. Think more about having conversations with people. You're there to talk about a problem, you're there to learn from them. So think of it more as a conversation, but with a little bit of a skew, because you always want to listen more than you talk. If you go into an interview and you come out of it, you know, an hour later and your throat is dry because you've been doing a lot of talking, that probably wasn't an interview, and you may not have gotten out of it all the things that you intended to get out of it. So, all right, if you remember nothing else, hopefully those 4 things will already put you ahead. But we'll get into some weightier stuff. So I've mentioned, you know, I'm a user experience person, and as a user experience person, we tend to go through something that we call a design thinking process. And we're kind of borrowed this slide from another version of a MESA workshop that we've done in the past, which covered the full design thinking process. Today, we're just going to focus on interviews, but to give a little bit more context, interviews are things that can happen really at any point during a complete process, but you will most commonly find them kind of at the front and at the end. And depending on where you are in the process, you're actually going to be focusing on slightly different things. So we'll start up front in the process, kind of in the empathize phase of things. So these are your early interviews. I believe some of the other MESA guidance has sometimes called this the notice phase as well. So this is the part very early in your project where you are starting to think about a potential problem that you're going to tackle. You're starting to think about who your end users might be, but you don't have an actual thing that you're presenting as a solution. And that's actually very, very important. You should, ideally, it's best practice, and I have to scold actual projects that, you know, try to invite me on all the time. You should be talking to people before you have a prototype of anything in your hand. One of the reasons for that is you kind of goes back to that very first bullet point of, if you remember nothing else, remember that your assumptions could be wrong. If you've already got a prototype and then you go talk to people, the thing in your hands may already not be what they need. It may be something that they're not going to be able to work with. And really, you've kind of set yourself up to do some extra work that maybe you could have saved yourself by just talking to people a little bit earlier. So when you're doing interviews up front, early in the process, you're there purely to understand and to notice what things are happening, what do people need help with. You're looking at any inequities that are there in a given problem that maybe you need to address. You're there to learn what constraints people have, what they've tried, what hasn't worked, their own priorities. You're there to be a learner. Now there's a bit of a cliche floating around. If you look at any kind of design thinking process or documentation, there are a number of different resources out there on the web. One of the cliches you'll run into is you know, a urban legend, I think, about, well, if, you know, Ford had asked people what do they want to solve their problem, they'd have said they wanted faster horses, and he never would have come up with the car. I think that's kind of limiting. It's not wrong, but it's a little bit limiting. I think the real legend would go something like, you know, Ford asked people, hey, what's your problem? Probably in slightly different words, but, you know, what's one of your priorities or some trouble that you're having? You know, what could we do to be fixing these things? And people would say, well, you know, the horses take too long to get from one place to another. You got to feed them. There's some issues here. And then ideally, you know, Ford would have gone away and thought about it for a bit and said, well, you know, what if we could come up with something that you didn't have to take care of, like a horse, that could go faster than a horse? So it isn't that if you ask people, you know, well, what do you want? They're not going to know. It's you can ask them what they want, but just don't limit yourself to literally their exact answer. All right. So I briefly mentioned a couple of different interview styles. When you think about interviews, don't limit yourself to just you know, thinking one-on-one. There are a couple of different options. Think about potentially going and observing people, where they work, where they live, if they will let you, of course. When you come up with a problem, it really helps to see all of the possible context around it. So consider doing maybe something observational. That also gives you an opportunity to take some richer notes. One of the things that's handy about that is that will help you see things that people have potentially forgotten to bring up if you were just talking to them one-on-one in a different location. Other things, we'll briefly cover focus groups here. That's when you would have you know, 2 or 3 or 4 even potential end users talking to you at the same time. one of the things that's nice about focus groups is it's kind of nice to listen to other people talk to peers about what their issues are, because then you hear them talk to each other kind of in their own terminology, their own language. You can learn more about hearing people agree or disagree with each other about what issues are than if you yourself had to sit there and necessarily think of all every single question, or try to think of every different angle of a question. So going into early interviews, it's kind of helpful to think to yourself, what research can you do beforehand, before you go interview people, so that you don't have to cover basics when you actually talk to them yourself. If you are able to learn, say, vocabulary, learn a little bit about their problem domain, you can spend more time talking about the problem that you want to address, as opposed to having to cover basics. Need to think about, who knows about the problem you want to solve, and who can tell you if you've made an incorrect assumption, what you need to find out to verify or validate that you're going down the right track. Something else that's very important is, to figure out how many different viewpoints you need. Many a good project has been derailed by focusing on a very small subset of people up front that didn't cover a very broad spectrum of people who might be using the end product. And we'll get into some exercises that kind of explore that here in a moment. Other things to think about is, will locations or physical environments be important to understand? And if so, then maybe that's a cue that you need to do something more observational than just, talking to somebody one-on-one in a coffee shop or over a Zoom meeting, for example. So real quick, because here I've been kind of motor mouthing it for a bit now, we'll take a brief pause just to kind of do a check. Based on what you've heard, what are some of the things that you might be thinking about while you're planning an interview? Or, of course, because I have been motor mouthing, if you've got any questions so far, now would also be a good time to kind of raise your hand and ask for a clarification.
So I think one of the things that we can, Manny Clausen here from New Mexico, I think one of the questions or things that I would worry about if I were in the classroom and I was a teacher, would you say, I would probably want the parents to know what my students are doing, maybe having their support, getting some waivers signed, getting with your admin people, like your principals or somebody in the school district that will fully support it, because as you know, we have to make sure that we take care of our students and that, we do it in a safe manner. So if they're going to go, let's say, and do this interview, maybe at the hospital, even if it's across the street, that we consider those things that need to be in place, right?
Yes.
And having the full support of your whether it's your high school department chair or your principal or your MESA advisor or even people in the district in the admin level might open up doors for you as well, by them maybe even providing you with feedback or even suggestions. They might be members of the Chamber of Commerce or some other organization, and they might know of things that are happening in our community that we might not be aware of, and give you a starting point. I haven't done a design human-centered. When I did attend or when my students did participate at the national level, we did the prosthetic arm, and that was many years ago. So I really find the resources that you're providing us today very useful. But those are, I think, some of the things, if I were still in the classroom, that I would probably worry about or want to make sure that my kids are prepared, that we have some kind of cheat sheet, if you will, right? To ask those
Yes.
questions.
Yeah, absolutely. And you bring up a really good point. There are going to be, obviously, apart from safety, security concerns, obviously must protect students. But in going through that process of kind of, you know, vetting the interview process with that greater community, there will be things you can learn from others who maybe aren't necessarily the folks that you're going to solve any particular problem for, but they are adjacent. So, if you are going to go into something like a hospital environment, taking the time to talk to, even administrators or community members who've been involved in that hospital environment, even if it's not, say, the patients themselves that you're going to go support, there will still be plenty of other people that you can learn from. So yes, and in the process of setting these things up while you're vetting it, there are all kinds of opportunities to learn about many different perspectives to a problem that will ultimately make those interviews go much smoother, will make them much more much more educational. I suppose that's the right word for it. So thank you for bringing that up. All right, I am getting the helpful ping that I'm chatting a bit much. So as we just mentioned, hey, kind of a checklist of things to think up when you're planning an interview. Obviously, these are kind of the basics. There are many things to consider, but at a minimum, you're going to want to think about things about who you're talking to and why. Being able to explain to a person, even in your introduction, we're here to talk about this particular project. I would like to talk to you because you have perspective on this part of the thing, and we're interested in solving this particular problem. That goes a really long way to making people feel comfortable talking to you. They know that you're going to take them seriously. They know that you've thought about the problem, and that you'll be prepared to actually listen to them. We have, towards the end of the deck, things that can go wrong in interviews and kind of how to fix them. And that's actually something that even professionals tend to forget from time to time. I've worked with a number of projects where people go in and just want to start asking interview participants, questions without really talking about why we're here, what the problem is, why they're involved, why we've asked them to be there today. And that can really be a barrier to people opening up and talking to you, is they just don't know what the process is. They don't know why you're talking to them. They don't know how they can help you. And so, yes, at a minimum, who are you talking to and why? Having a goal. And I think the other thing I would stress in any of these tips is have a plan for taking notes. Notes, it can be a little bit easy to get overwhelmed by a conversation. It's actually, that's kind of a good thing, when you get really super engrossed into what the people's saying and you're having a good conversation. But if you have to pause to stop and write down what they're saying, that's going to kind of interrupt everybody's train of thoughts. So having a plan for taking notes is always a good thing. And also potentially backups. You may not necessarily be able to record, say, like a Teams or a Zoom meeting that you can replay later. So it may be helpful to have more than one person trying to conduct an interview. Maybe assign a dedicated note taker, and so one person can focus on keeping the conversation going, and another can focus on taking notes. All right. So briefly, this is kind of the other stumbling block, at least in early interviews that I have seen. What makes a good question? We'll repeat the often said, keep it simple for obvious reasons. We really don't get bonus points for being clever when we ask questions. I have worked with people who have tried to make very scientific, precise questions for interview protocols, and it's not helpful. It's really not helpful. So the simplest, most clear, most direct question you can ask is probably going to be the best one. you know, it will be open-ended, more like an essay question. If all you're getting are yes, no answers from people, that's actually not a very helpful interview. And so you may have to take a harder look at the questions that you're asking, making sure that they're not, you know, giving somebody a statement that they feel like they have to agree with. That's usually another place where people can go wrong, is accidentally asking the other person to agree with everything you're saying. Some people do that just out of politeness because they don't want to hurt your feelings. Sometimes you get lucky, and you're working with a person who really doesn't worry about not hurting your feelings and is happy to correct you when you say something wrong. I actually enjoy those interviews much more, because I like learning things. But you know, good questions keep people talking and don't make them feel like they are trapped in a little box giving you answers that you want to hear and may or may not be something that they actually agree with. All right. I think in the interest of time, yes, poor Liz has got to be sweating over here. I am far behind our original intended. So we may have to make this a little bit briefer. Our example goes something like this. We've been asked to help a friend redesign a website for their business. Their business grew out of, you know, their love of crafting, especially knitting. So now they run a site that lets people buy and sell new patterns and supplies. Because our friend has really been involved in this crafting knitting community for a long time, they've got this really enthusiastic customer base. So now their site includes a forum for, you know, finding groups of people with similar interests, people teaching other people crafting techniques, exchanging tips on how to get better. So they would like to improve their websites. And so we thought we would take a moment here. We thought we would take a moment here to just kind of think about, in a scenario like this, where you potentially have a very broad user base, potentially many different interests, potentially many different conflicting interests. Maybe not necessarily everyone is going to agree. Who are the people that we would most likely want to interview? Who would we prioritize interviewing? And what would we need to do to consider or to make sure that we're being equitable as we go about this process? And I think we have some breakout rooms ready to go. So we'll take, you know, a couple of minutes to just think amongst ourselves. Yeah, who would we be focused on interviewing, and how would we make sure that this process is equitable?
All right, so I'm going to open up the breakout rooms. You'll have 2 other people with you. There's a Jamboard link in the chat. If you could click on that and open it up. And the same questions that Lyndsey posed to you all verbally are on there. If you ever use Jamboard, you can just post a little post-it note, so that way you can actually answer the questions on there with your group. I'm going to go ahead and open up the rooms. You will have 5 minutes. All right, I'm going to run around and put the Jamboard link in the chat of each room.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you.
everybody's back.
I'm just excited because somebody has a sticky up there. Y'all weren't reading my notes ahead of time, were you? So welcome back. Hopefully you had a chance to think about, you know, in this particular situation, you know, kind of a lightweight example, you know, who might you interview, and how would you make sure things are being equitable? I see from the Jamboard, particularly around, you know, hey, who would we interview? We got a couple of different thoughts. People already thinking about, you know, representative demographics, you know, teens and up. So maybe there are some age-based considerations. You know, a teen user is probably going to be very different from, say, a person in their 60s or even 70s. Some folks even taking a moment to think about, well, where would we interview people and how long? I see some notes over there, well, it depends on, customers, maybe it's an online poll, could it be in person, over the phone, considerations, how do we make sure that it's equitable? Somebody has a big one. Where did it go? Oh, there's the accessibility sticky. Big deal when it comes to the internet in some very surprising ways. And hopefully I go fast enough that I can tell you the punchline, because this is actually a kind of a real story that we based this particular exercise on. So things like accessibility, maybe some technological challenges that they have to deal with. So cool. Sounds like you all are definitely thinking in the right direction in terms of, how would you start this process, and go about starting it on an equitable footing. Before I motor mouth on, does anybody have any questions on kind of this early interview process? Is there anything I can clear up, or maybe you want to hear me hit again real briefly? Okay. Well, you're definitely welcome to put questions in the chat, and we're going to definitely save time for Q&A at the end. So if you have a question, hold on to it, and we will make sure you get time to ask at the end. So let's see, just kind of a quick recap. Having a goal and focusing about learning the problem is really your purpose in the early interviews. Taking the chance to observe people or even talk to small groups to get potentially some different information than if you were just talking to somebody one-on-one, can be a really good idea. And to make sure that when you go to do interviews and prep those questions, making sure that they're open-ended questions as much as possible, but balance that with being simple, direct, and clear. Okay, so just kind of a quick refresher here. Full design thinking process is going to have many different phases. So we talked about how interviews would look and some tips and pointers for how to focus on interviews in that empathize and notice part of the process. The other part of the process where you will very commonly find interviews, not that you won't find them in kind of the middle steps, but interviews tend to come back at, say, the end of a design thinking process, where now you've gone through the full understand a problem, you've defined it, you've got some prototype ideas. Interviews kind of come back as a great way of collecting feedback and making those prototypes better towards the end of the process. So briefly, what something like that will look like. You can and should bring those prototypes with you to interviews later in the process. Don't leave them at home. You don't even have to wait for them to be a complete solution either. It's very, very common, once you've got even a little bit of a thing to play with, to take it to people and collect their thoughts on it. Despite you will hear in many different design circles, people will say, don't ever ask people if they like your prototype. Well, okay, that's a little bit simplistic. Definitely ask people, if you take somebody a thing, you can ask, what do you think about this? Is there any part of this you like? Is there some part that you wish was different? The trick is you just don't want to put people in that position where they have to agree with you that, your idea is the best solution ever, and there's no problems with it. If that's what you're hearing, kind of the end of the process, you are either the 1 in a million shot that really did get it right on the first try, or it's far more likely that people feel like they have to agree with you, and they're just being polite. Embrace embrace learning that your prototype is not perfect. That's really difficult. And even as I say it, I understand how difficult that can be, to take something that you have put a lot of hours and effort into making as best as you possibly can, and then taking it to somebody in here that they want something slightly different. Real world professionals definitely struggle with this. If any of you ever have a chance to work on any kind of a web development project, I can, can't even, lost track a long time ago the number of people I have worked with who have had really difficult times hearing that they needed to tweak something that they had spent hours on. So you are in good company if that's an uncomfortable feeling, but it is a necessary part of the process to make your ideas better. Let's see. So going into this part of the process, you'll ask yourself slightly different questions getting ready for the interview or the feedback session itself. You will probably want to pick a particular part of your solution that you want to focus on, and be really focused on asking questions, say, around that. You might want to actually give people prototypes if you can, let them work with it on their own, without you there, just to see, they can get comfortable with it, they can get a feel for it, and then ask them questions about it. Sometimes it's really difficult if somebody's just been handed a thing, they've never used it before. Some people like to take the time to figure it out on their own before they can actually talk to you about what they like, what they wish you would do differently. And as with early interviews, this is something they have in common. Do have a plan for documenting, capturing feedback. Now, when it comes to collecting feedback, we have a couple of different ways of going about this. These are two techniques that I've run across in my years that actually work very well in a surprisingly broad range of types of projects. So one we call I like, I wish, what if. So this is where you've got a prototype, you're taking it to somebody, you've given them a chance to use it, and then you focus the rest of the conversation around what they like, what they wish they could change, and what new ideas does this particular prototype, make them think of. Like, hey, what if it did this other thing and not just what it does now? That can be a great way of phrasing your conversation. It keeps a generally positive spin on it, so people don't feel like they're being overly critical, even if they have things that they would like you to change. So that can be a really good way of documenting, hey, here are the good things we did, don't change these or make them better. Here are the things we do need to change, and here are some new ideas that maybe we can work in. The other is the feedback capture grid. It's kind of similar, but it merges a couple of the other categories. So with the feedback capture grid, there's a more clear distinction between, well, here's what they like, here's what's working, here's a space for what they didn't like, what's not working. Questions that people have when people interact with, a new tool or a new device or something that you've put in front of them. It can be very informative to write down the questions that they have about it. Those are things that maybe they didn't think about, or they're things that are a little bit confusing that you can still improve on. But listening to the questions that people have can also be a very informative part of making your own ideas better. And then, of course, always be open for new ideas that, once somebody has something in their hands, it can be a lot easier for them to either talk about the problem or things just become more concrete. And that will generate a different set of ideas than if you're just in an interview talking about something in the abstract. So we have, I'm going to lose them. We will get you, we have worksheets that we have prepared that shows this feedback capture grid in particular, and has kind of an example of how you might use this as part of your design process for documenting the feedback that you get from people and turning that into changes that you might make on a given prototype. Now, the one thing that will happen, and hopefully we teased this a little bit in even the early interview portion of today, is, here's back to our crafting website. The feedback that you hear from people may actually conflict. So any two given people looking at the same prototype, totally, almost guaranteed, you will hear different opinions on it. And so one of the things that can actually be kind of difficult to do, as a designer, somebody who's in this part of the process, is figuring out, well, how do you reconcile these things? So here, by way of example, continuing with our crafting website theme here, let's pretend we've gone through our interviews, and one of the things that we learned in our early interview process was, hey, people were having difficulties searching for things. So maybe we've done some drawing on our end and come up with this as a potential solution for how we might do the search feature on our friend's website. And so we've taken this to people, and we've heard these four things. So maybe we hear things like, well, I like having the boxes, but I can't really see what's in the links. Or it's really helpful having one place to go searching. Thick lines around the boxes make it kind of uncomfortable to look at. But earlier we had somebody who did like the boxes, but somebody else is now saying, well, they're kind of uncomfortable. Or another person who says, what if I don't know what to search for? Can't I just browse what's out there? So hearing, there's the feedback worksheet. Thank you, Liz. Saying, for example, we've heard these from our interviews. We thought we would take a moment here to just kind of brainstorm a little bit. How would you tease out what kind of improvements might be made to, say, the search feature from just these 4 bullet points? And go with your gut. You don't have to think too hard. This is just to give you kind of an idea of, information is going to conflict when you get feedback. We'll still need to figure out how to make improvements from there. So here's some practice on doing that.
So in the chat, there is a link to a Padlet to be able to add and answer the question Lyndsey just posed. You just press the plus sign that's at the bottom. And it's really just asking how would you implement the feedback? What are some steps you would take? And we're just going to have about 1 minute to think about it and post your idea. Thank you to those who are starting to post. Take about another 30 seconds. Put your ideas up there.
it is so hard. And it is so hard, especially if you're on a larger project team. I'm sure you can imagine a case where you've got, I'm just going to pick on websites. You know, you've got developers who put their heart and soul into getting search bar to work as it does, you know, and then they hear from people that it doesn't work in a helpful way. Yeah, things like increasing fonts, changing labels. This is the part of the process where it actually does get incredibly difficult. Figuring out how to pick which feedback, or how to organize the feedback into ways that there's a clear path forward is never really as clear as we think it's going to be. Yep. So in the interest of time, I want to keep this moving forward. Clearly, I have a lot to say on the subject of interviews. This is really one of the best parts of my job is going and talking to people. So as per usual, I have way more slides than I could have ever possibly hoped to cover. But just a quick recap, you know, later stage interviews, they are really a lot of fun. I've kind of stressed, you know, don't get defensive. I think that's probably the biggest challenge when it comes to the later stage interviews is, you know, we want people to like our solutions, and it really can be difficult if people aren't just immediately 100% enthusiastic about it. But that's a great opportunity to make your good ideas even greater. You know, when people have questions, when they ask you to make changes, that's actually a very good thing. It's definitely an opportunity to kind of empathize with where people are coming from, learn more about the problem that maybe didn't come out in, say, even your early interviews, because, you know, even the most thorough of projects, when they do early interviews, they don't get everything completely covered. So last things I'll mention, you know, things that go wrong, how to fix them, running out of time. Clearly that's an issue, even in presentation. So advice I would give myself is, you know, hey, pick a topic and then take out half of your slides, because yeah, time goes much faster. So again, be focused, see what you can learn ahead of time so that you're not trying to learn everything in your interviews. Getting overwhelmed, you know, have a plan for taking notes. That definitely helps the best. And, you know, just focus on having a conversation. If it doesn't go exactly to plan according to the questions you have written out, that's okay if you're still learning. People seem confused, don't really want to talk. You know, take the time to introduce yourself and your process. You know what you're there for, and you are asking them to help you. Take the time to help them understand their part in the process, and set them up so that you know, they feel comfortable talking to you, and feel that they can ask you questions or even disagree with you if need to. So final thoughts, I need to wrap up because you all probably have many, many questions. So I will try to cut myself off here. Thank you again for your time, for joining us today. And please, any questions that you have, I'm happy to stick around past time, since I have been talking far too much.
Lyndsey, can you post was it the second slide maybe that had you guys' info on there?
Sure.
Are you asking for emails? 'Cause I don't think we have our
Yes.
emails on there.
Oh yeah, we did not
Did
have.
it have it or not?
No, but we can type them
Oh.
in the chat really quick.
Okay.
So, and also understand that you can also reach out to your NEDC rep, and they know how to get towards me, and our information is also on the website. So if you
Awesome.
wanted to, you know, me directly for Washington Mesa, or also you can reach out to New Mexico.
Thank you.
And if anybody just wants the punchline to our crafting story, I can stick around and you can hear the actual full gory details of our very real world example, actually.
All right,
And
so I want to be mindful of time for anyone who needs to leave at this time. So I'm going to end the recording and thank you very much for joining us. But as Lyndsey said, we'll still be here for a few minutes for anyone who may want to stick around and have further questions. Thank you.
Hi there, Lyndsey.
Hello.
Yeah, I was just having this question as you were presenting because I have been experiencing this in my MESA class. I'm having how do you call this, issues on guiding the students to come up with the initial interviews for their clients, because most of the time the students will push their ideas, thinking of the prototype that they already wanted to build and not really getting the idea from their clients or their users.
Mhm.
And I was wondering how you could maybe give me
Yeah.
ideas on how to handle
Sure.
that.
That is a huge, huge temptation.
Yeah.
And it's not just students, it's a temptation forever. I think that's kind of our human nature is we see a problem, we want to fix it, we've got an idea.
Yeah.
And I think in something like that, you do kind of a blend of maybe those later stage interviews and kind of the early stage
Mhm.
interviews. Sometimes, as much as we would like to protect them from it, sometimes people need to be told that they're wrong. And that seems like a very cruel thing to say, but it may be, students have an idea, they're really passionate about it. It's okay to take that with an early interview,
Uh-huh.
and ask people in those early interviews, okay, we have this initial idea, and start a conversation from that place. It's not ideal. I think long term, it's probably better if people come in without the preconceived notions.
Yeah.
But there's nothing inherently wrong with kind of doing it flipped
All right.
or the other way around. It's far better that students take that kind of preconceived idea to
Mhm.
people early on and ask them about it than it is to skip any part of that process. So
Yeah.
I think with